There was a question that none of the 5 banks ever asked. 5 banks, 5 contracts, each one reviewed carefully. Each one checked the counterparty's reputation, the collateral structure, the capacity to repay. They followed the process. They found nothing wrong. What none of them was required to do was compare notes with the others. There was no regulation that forced Kabir Sethi to disclose how many of these agreements he had signed. Each bank saw its own slice and found it acceptable. Not one of them saw the whole. Kabir Sethi had spent years making sure they would not. He called it Sethi Capital. But Sethi Capital was not the beginning of the story. And on a Tuesday morning in Delhi, when the name appeared on the Bloomberg margin call wire at 9 o'clock, with the city loud and moving outside as if nothing had changed, it was clear it would not be the end either. His son called from London. His voice was calm, not the calm of someone who does not know, the calm of someone who has just understood something and is deciding what to do with that understanding. Kabir told him not to worry. Then he ended the call. The first time Kabir lost everything, people said he had not played by the rules. This time he had played by the rules, and that was the problem. Kabir Sethi grew up in Paharganj. Not the part tourists photograph, but the back streets, where the buildings lean toward each other and the morning light arrives narrow and late. His father ran a small textile stall for 30 years. Same stall, same street, same hours. There was a man 2 lanes over, Mr. Malhotra, who drove a white ambassador, wore press clothes, and received visitors in the evenings. The neighborhood called him successful. His father said, "That car belongs to the bank, not to Mr. Malhotra." The bank. Learn to tell the difference between what a man has and what people believe he has. That gap, his father said, is either wisdom or ruin. Nothing in between. Kabir was 12. He did not forget. He studied finance at Delhi University, finished at the top. Apex Capital India hired him at 24. Within 3 years, he was managing positions that men in their 40s had spent decades earning the right to touch. Then came the Reliance trade. The market had discounted the company's infrastructure ambitions as unrealistic. Kabir had read the supply chain data differently. He had tracked the procurement patterns for months. He understood something about the company's trajectory that the consensus had not yet priced. He went in large. When the position paid, it was not luck. For 1 year, Kabir Sethi had everything: the calls, the recognition, the respect of people he had followed from a distance since his days as a graduate student. James Whitfield reviewed his analysis once, after a presentation. Whitfield said nothing. He simply nodded once, looked at Kabir for a moment, and turned away. That nod was the feeling Kabir would spend the rest of his life trying to recreate. In 2012, the allegation came: insider trading. No evidence sufficient for conviction. But in finance, acquittal is not the same as exoneration. Suspicion is enough. Apex Capital let him go quietly, not because of wrongdoing, because of perception. He told himself it was unjust. And it was. He spent a year between identities. His wife watched him across the breakfast table each morning. She did not ask what he was thinking. She already knew. She waited. That was what she could do. Then Kabir founded Sethi Capital, family office structure. He told her it was the right vehicle for long-term asset management. That was true. What he did not say was that Sethi Capital was also an argument. A case built since the afternoon. He walked out of Apex Capital, addressed to everyone who had believed the allegation instead of the acquittal. The case required proof. The proof required performance. And performance at the scale he needed required leverage. The leverage required 5 banks, none of them aware of the others. The market remembers everything. including the things a person would prefer it to forget. Sethi Capital performed well in its first years. The Reliance position tracked the company's energy transition the same way Kabir had tracked its infrastructure build-out in 2010. Through 2019 and into 2020, the numbers confirmed what he already believed. But this time, no one was watching. That was the problem he could not name. At Apex Capital, performance had meant something because someone senior had seen it, confirmed it. Whitfield's nod, the calls from investors. Without that external confirmation, the numbers were just numbers, and Kabir needed them to be more than that. So the positions grew. The leverage expanded. He approached 2 additional banks and structured the exposure so that each counterpart saw only its portion. No single institution held enough information to assess the aggregate risk. He knew what he was building. He did not discuss it with anyone. By late 2020, the Reliance position had stalled. The market was reassessing the company's green energy timeline. Kabir wrote an internal memo explaining why the market was wrong. He sent it to himself. He read it 3 times. Each reading made him more certain. January 2021, Reliance reported quarterly results below expectations. The stock dropped 12% in 5 sessions. His assistant sent an email asking whether the position size should be reviewed. Kabir replied that the market was overreacting to short-term noise. The thesis was unchanged. The numbers kept dropping. They did not stop to read his analysis. He called a former colleague from Apex Capital, a man who ran a fund in Mumbai. He did not call for advice. He called to explain the thesis, to hear himself explain it to someone who understood the mechanics, who would push back if the logic had a hole. The colleague listened carefully. He asked 3 questions about the position size. He said he could see the logic. He was less certain about the timing. He asked whether the drawdown had changed the risk calculus. Kabir thanked him and ended the call. He told himself the colleague was being cautious, conservative. That had always been his limitation. He did not call again. That same week, Kabir came home late for the 3rd consecutive time. His wife had already eaten. His dinner was on the table, covered with a plate to keep it warm. He sat down, ate alone, and went to his study. She did not come to say goodnight. The next morning she had made 2 portions of breakfast, as she always did. But when he came downstairs, she was already gone. Coat, bag, keys. The door closed quietly while he was still on the stairs. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and opened the market app. February. The stock did not recover. Kabir added to the position. The lower price, he reasoned, represented a better entry point. The thesis had not changed. The market was wrong about the timeline. It had been wrong before. He had been right about Reliance once, when no one believed him. He would be right again. The numbers kept dropping. They did not stop to read his analysis. Early March. Reliance announced a new share issuance for the green energy program. The market read dilution. Kabir read commitment. He wrote another memo, sent it to himself. He added again. He opened his laptop on a Wednesday afternoon and saw the email from his assistant sitting unread. It was 3 lines. It asked whether risk management protocols should be reviewed given the current drawdown. His hands were on the keyboard. He read the email twice. The cursor sat in the reply field, blinking. He closed the laptop. He told himself he would respond after the next session. The market opened. He did not respond. By the time the next email arrived, the question had become irrelevant. The leverage was now eating into actual capital. Every day that passed without a recovery consumed a fraction of the real assets behind the structure. The architecture he had built, elegant and invisible when the market moved in his favor, was disassembling in the same orderly sequence by which it had been assembled. By the second week of March, the first bank had reached its threshold. Kabir Sethi, the man who had stood on Dalal Street and been counted among the people whose judgment moved markets, picked up the phone and called someone to ask for money. For the first time in his life, the answer was no. And in the silence that followed, he understood. The market was not going to confirm him anymore. It had stopped reading a long time ago. Monday, before the market opened, the first bank began selling. Not one bank. All of them. In sequence. Each one executing the contract Kabir had signed. Not punishing him. Not judging him. Simply enforcing the terms both parties had agreed to in the years when those terms had seemed like formalities. He watched it happen on one screen. The positions he had built over years unwinding in a single morning. The cascade logic he had studied and used was now moving in the opposite direction. He had explained this exact mechanism to a junior analyst the previous year, had drawn it on a whiteboard, had said, once the cascade begins, the structure has no way to arrest itself. Now the cascade was his. Cancel all meetings for the day, he told his assistant. His voice was normal. The assistant asked for a reason. Kabir said he needed to focus on some internal matters. His son called from London at 9:30, but the voice was different this time.
Hello?
Earlier that morning, it had been the voice of someone who feared what they might hear. Now it was quieter. The voice of someone who had already seen the wire and understood what it meant. Kabir said not to worry. His son said, "Dad, I can see the news." Kabir did not answer. He ended the call and set the phone on his desk. Outside, the street noise from Connaught Place rose and fell. A horn, a motorbike, the ordinary sounds of a city that had not stopped. 3 days later, his wife sat down across from him at the kitchen table. She did not raise her voice. She asked one question, "Is the family money in there?" He did not answer. The silence lasted long enough that the answer was no longer necessary. Her face was not angry. It was something past anger. The expression of a person who has spent a long time hoping to be wrong about something and has finally stopped hoping. She asked, "Does anyone else know?" "No," he said. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below for a moment. Then she picked up her bag from the chair by the door and left for work. The apartment was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. For the next 2 weeks, Kabir still came to the office. He arrived at the same time. He worked through administrative tasks that no longer served any purpose. Nobody asked him anything. They had read the news. On the second Tuesday, he stopped in front of the framed article on the wall. Reliance Industries, 2010. The bet that had made his name. He looked at it for a moment, then he kept walking. He did not take it down. His assistant came every day until the last day. On the final afternoon, he stopped at the door. "I'm sorry it ended this way, sir." Kabir looked at him. "Yes," he said. The assistant left. The office was empty. Kabir sat at the desk after everyone had gone. The small blue notebook he had used to track the positions was still there, where he had left it. He looked at it. He did not open it again. 10 years earlier, James Whitfield had nodded at him. Once. Just once. That nod had been the feeling Kabir Sethi had spent the rest of his life trying to recreate. Now there was no one left to nod, and no one left to tell. I walked into the old offices of Sethi Capital. The room was almost empty. The screens were gone. The cables were still there, coiled on the floor. On the wall, a faint rectangular outline where something had hung for years, and then been removed. Kabir was already there when I arrived. He stood up. I said, "Well, thank you for agreeing to meet."
Not many people want to talk to me anymore.
He smiled, faintly.
You chose a good time.
We sat down. Between us, an empty desk. No papers, no screens. Only dust in the places where equipment had been, and a small blue notebook still on the desk. It had been 6 weeks since Sethi Capital closed. I asked him a question that perhaps no one had asked before. I asked, "What was Sethi Capital really to you?" Kabir did not answer immediately. He looked at the room, at the outline on the wall.
Sethi Capital was not a fund. It was a case I was building. A case against an accusation that no one was making anymore. No one except me.
He looked toward the window, then back.
I had been trying to prove something to Apex Capital, to the industry, to everyone who had read the allegation and believed it. But Apex Capital had moved on. The industry had moved on.
I asked, "When did you understand you were no longer making financial decisions but protecting a story?"
There was an email from my assistant, 3 lines. He asked whether we should review the position size. I did not reply.
Kabir paused. His hands were on the desk, still.
That was the moment. The moment I started explaining to other people why they were wrong instead of checking whether I might be. I had stopped making investment decisions.
The sound of traffic from Connaught Place came up from below. Faint, like from another world. I asked, "On the morning your son called from London, on the morning the banks began selling off every share of Reliance in your portfolio, what was the first thing you thought?"
I thought, do not let him read it. But he already had. I let my son find out through a news terminal in London instead of hearing it from me. That is the thing that cannot be recovered.
He picked up the small blue notebook, held it in both hands, then set it back down. Kabir looked at me for the first time since the question had been asked. I asked, "What did your wife say after she understood the family money was in there?" Outside car horns, traffic, life continuing.
She only asked if anyone else knew. She was thinking about our children while I was still thinking about the trade. The distance between us at that table, that morning. I do not have the right words for that distance.
I asked, "If you could say one thing to yourself in 2012, Kabir Sethi, who had just left Apex Capital, what would you say?" He thought for a long time. When he answered, his voice was calm, almost relieved.
I would tell him it is all right to be doubted, that the market does not care how intelligent you are, and I would tell him that his son will not read about him on Bloomberg, that the boy will hear it from him directly. Thank you for coming.
I stood up. Before I turned, I looked at him once, and I nodded, just once. He saw it. Something shifted in his expression, in a way I could not name. I walked out. In the corridor, I stopped for a moment before I kept going. There are men who spend their whole lives proving they were right. Kabir Sethi was luckier than most. He lived long enough to know the difference. Sethi Capital closed formally, May 2021. 3 banks are pursuing recovery proceedings. The legal process has no conclusion yet. The family assets are being liquidated, in stages. Kabir is still in Delhi. There is no office to go to. His wife is still there. His son in London has not come back since March. He did not say this when we met. He did not need to. The small blue notebook is still in that office. He left it on the desk the day the company closed. He went back once, 6 weeks later, when I came to find him. He sat with it on the desk between us for an hour. Then he left it there again. He has not gone back since. In 2012, when he left Apex Capital India, he told himself it was the beginning of a new chapter. Sethi Capital was that chapter. Now it has ended in a way that leaves the simplest question unanswered. What he does not know is what he would be building toward this time, and whether the thing he was trying to prove still needs proving, and to whom. He has not answered that question. 5 banks. Not one of them asked that question either. And the only question no one asked Kabir was the one he was sitting with, alone in an empty office. It is possible no one ever will. Kabir Sethi did not lose his money because he chose the wrong stock. He lost it because he needed the market to finish a story that the market had no obligation to finish. That story is still open. So is the case. The market had finished reading. This is one of many stories like this. I am Maya, the host of Wealth Paradox Global. Kabir rebuilt everything from nothing after the first collapse, then lost it all a second time. The second time cost more, because he understood exactly what he was doing. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who is in the middle of building something they cannot afford to lose. Subscribe to Wealth Paradox Global for more stories like this one. Like this video if you saw something in Kabir's story that you recognized in yourself. And leave a comment. What is the story you are still trying to prove to someone who has already stopped watching?